It was the dead of winter, just after the holidays, and I had rented a small cabin upstate to take a break from city life. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a chaotic year: no neighbors, no noise, just me, my dog Scout, and the surrounding forest. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove and large windows that offered a stunning view of the snow-covered landscape. The first couple of days passed peacefully. I spent my time hiking through the woods, reading by the fire, and enjoying the serenity of being cut off from the world. But by the third night, a snowstorm rolled in, blanketing everything in a thick, suffocating silence. That's when things started to feel off. The storm raged outside as I sat in the living room with Scout curled up at my feet. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but the cabin felt warm and safe. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I locked the doors, stoked the fire to keep it burning through the night, and brought Scout upstairs with me. I woke in the middle of the night to Scout growling softly. His ears were perked, and he was staring intently at the bedroom door. My first thought was that he'd heard an animal outside, maybe a deer or a fox. But then I realized the sound that had woken him wasn't coming from outside. It was footsteps. They were faint, almost muffled by the thick carpet of snow, but unmistakable. Someone was walking around the cabin. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and crept to the window. Peering through the frosted glass, I could just make out the edge of the porch. There was no one there, but the sound continued, circling the cabin slowly and deliberately. I grabbed my phone, only to find I had no signal. The storm must have knocked out the reception. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone gotten lost in the storm? Was it a neighbor in trouble? Or was it something worse? The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that whoever it was must have left. I climbed back into bed, though sleep didn't come easily. In the morning, I found tracks in the snow. They circled the cabin several times before leading off into the woods. The prints were large, too large to be from a regular hiker, and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had been walking with a deliberate, measured pace. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more purposeful, and accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged. Scout barked furiously, pacing back and forth in front of the door. I grabbed a fire poker from the hearth and positioned myself near the window, peeking out cautiously. The storm had eased, and the moonlight reflected off the snow, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and unmoving, its features obscured by the shadows. In its hand, it held something long and sharp, glinting faintly in the light. I froze, gripping the fire poker tightly. The figure didn't move, didn't react to Scout's barking. It just stood there, staring at the cabin. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving no trace but a fresh set of tracks. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. I kept the fire burning and didn't dare go to sleep. By morning, the tracks were gone, covered by a fresh layer of snow. But that wasn't the end of it. The following evening, as I was chopping wood behind the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. Carved into one of the trees near the cabin was a symbol, a crude, circular shape with jagged lines radiating from it. It was fresh, the bark still raw where it had been cut. I grabbed Scout and locked us inside, determined to leave the next morning. But that night, as the storm picked up again, I heard something new. A knock at the door. It wasn't a polite, tentative knock. It was slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, Scout growling at my side. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, for what felt like hours. When it finally stopped, I thought it was over. But then I heard it, the sound of something being dragged across the porch, followed by a loud thud. I didn't open the door. In the morning, I found what had made the noise. Lying on the porch was a deer carcass, its body mutilated and arranged in a grotesque display. The same symbol that had been carved into the tree was now etched into the snow beside it. I packed my things and left immediately, driving through the snowstorm without stopping. When I reached the nearest town, I called the local authorities, but they didn't seem concerned. Probably just some pranksters, they said. But I knew better. To this day, I don't know who, or what, was outside that cabin. But every winter, when the first snow falls, I think about the tracks, the symbol, and the figure in the woods. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow the sound of footsteps in the snow. 2 winters ago, my college friends and I decided to rent a remote cabin for a weekend getaway in the mountains. It was our way of escaping the stress of finals and enjoying some peace and quiet. The cabin was advertised as rustic but well-maintained, nestled deep in the woods and far from the nearest town. It sounded perfect, isolated, cozy, and surrounded by snow-covered wilderness. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the trees. The cabin was larger than I expected, with a wraparound porch and tall windows that overlooked a frozen lake. The air was crisp and cold, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath our boots. But as we unloaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Inside, the cabin was charming but had an eerie stillness about it. The walls were lined with faded wood paneling, and a massive stone fireplace dominated the living room. A layer of dust covered the furniture, suggesting no one had been there in a while, but everything else seemed in order. As night fell, we lit a fire and cooked dinner. The mood was light, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. By the time we went to bed, the unease I'd felt earlier had mostly faded. That changed around midnight. I woke to the sound of a door creaking. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, but as I listened, I realized the sound was coming from downstairs. I sat up, straining to hear. The faint creak came again, followed by soft, deliberate footsteps. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed and grabbed my phone. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkened living room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the walls. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed the front door. It was wide open, swinging gently in the cold wind. I woke my friend Eric, who had brought his camping knife. Together, we searched the cabin and surrounding yard, but there was no sign of anyone. The snow outside was untouched, and the door itself showed no signs of forced entry. Probably just the wind, Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. We locked the door and went back to bed, though I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of who, or what, could have opened the door. I told myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. The next day, we decided to explore the area around the cabin. The lake was frozen solid, its surface covered in a smooth layer of snow. As we walked along the shoreline, we found something that made us stop in our tracks. Footprints. They were large, human-shaped, but oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had taken impossibly long strides. The tracks led from the edge of the woods to the middle of the lake, where they abruptly stopped. There were no return prints, no sign of anyone falling through the ice, just an eerie, abrupt end. Maybe they turned back and walked in their own tracks, suggested Lauren, another friend. But we all knew how unlikely that was. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin grew colder than usual. No matter how much we stoked the fire, the chill seemed to seep through the walls. We tried to distract ourselves with games and movies, but the mood was tense. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. We scrambled to find flashlights and candles, but the sudden darkness heightened our unease. The snowstorm that had been brewing all day intensified, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Every creak and groan of the wooden beams made my heart race. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm. But as we fell silent, it grew louder, sharp, deliberate knocks on the front door. Eric grabbed his knife, and we all huddled together, staring at the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of something moving around the cabin. It was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, circling the house. Every now and then, they paused, as if whoever, or whatever, it was listening. I wanted to call the police, but my phone had no signal, and the landline in the cabin was dead. We were completely cut off. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, from the kitchen, we heard a loud crash. Eric led the way, flashlight in hand, as we crept toward the sound. The back door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. On the counter was a single object, a wooden carving of a figure, crudely made, with long, spindly arms and an eyeless face. None of us had seen it before. "What the hell is this?" Lauren whispered, her voice shaking. Eric slammed the door shut and locked it, but the unease in the room was palpable. Something was toying with us, and we had no idea why. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. The knocking returned, louder and more frantic, coming from all sides of the cabin. Shadows moved outside the windows, flickering in the flashlight beams. At one point, we heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl, but distorted and unnatural. By dawn, the storm had subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. We packed our things and left as quickly as we could, not bothering to clean up or check for more footprints. When we reached the nearest town, we told the locals what had happened. An older man at the diner listened intently, his face grim. "You shouldn't have gone to that cabin," he said. "It's been empty for years. The last people who stayed there, well, let's just say they didn't leave on their own. We never found out who, or what, had been outside that night. But I'll never forget the sound of the knocking, or the figure we found on the kitchen counter. It still haunts my dreams, especially in the dead of winter, when the world is silent and the snow hides all traces of what might be lurking just beyond the trees." It was early January, the dead of winter, and my sister Lila and I were driving back from a holiday visit to our grandparents in a remote part of Montana. The drive was supposed to be a straightforward 6-hour journey through snow-covered plains and winding mountain roads, but halfway through, a sudden snowstorm hit. The flakes came down fast and thick, blanketing the road in minutes. The visibility was so poor we could barely see the taillights of the car in front of us. Lila and I exchanged nervous glances, and after another mile of crawling along the icy road, we decided to pull over at the first safe spot we could find. That's when we saw the sign for the motel. It was one of those rundown places you only see in the middle of nowhere, rusted metal sign, dim neon letters spelling out Mountain View Lodge, even though there wasn't a mountain in sight. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a couple of cars buried under a layer of snow. It didn't look like much, but with the storm showing no signs of letting up, it was our best option. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew and old coffee. A thin man with tired eyes stood behind the counter, absently flipping through a magazine. He barely looked up as we walked in. "Room for two?" Lila asked, her voice chipper in contrast to the dreary surroundings. The man nodded, sliding a key across the counter without a word. "Room 14. The brass key was cold and heavy in my hand, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a strange unease as we left the lobby. The room was as unimpressive as we'd expected, worn-out carpet, floral bedspreads that had seen better days, and a small TV perched on a wooden dresser. But it was warm, and that was all that mattered. We settled in, turned on the heater, and tried to relax. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling against the windows like something alive. Lila flipped through the channels on the TV, but most of them were static. She finally landed on an old black and white movie and turned the volume down. "Not exactly 5-star, huh?" she joked. I laughed, though the unease hadn't left me. Something about the place felt off. I told myself it was just the storm, the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around 10 p.m., the lights flickered. Lila and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything. A few minutes later, they flickered again, and this time, the TV cut out, replaced by a high-pitched whine. Lila tried changing the channel, but the sound persisted, sharp and grating. Then, without warning, the screen went black. A single word appeared, stark and clear against the darkness: "Leave." "What the hell?" Lila muttered, grabbing the remote and jabbing at the buttons. The screen flickered, the word disappearing, replaced by static. After a moment, the TV shut off entirely. "Probably just a glitch," I said, though my voice was shaky. Lila nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe it either. We decided to call the front desk, but the phone in the room was dead. Our cell phones had no signal, likely due to the storm. The thought of walking back to the lobby made my stomach churn, but I didn't want to stay in the room either. "I'll go," I said reluctantly. "You stay here." Lila nodded, her expression tense. "Don't take too long." The walk to the lobby was eerie. The hallway lights flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows on the stained wallpaper. I passed a few other rooms, all of them silent and dark. It felt like we were the only ones in the entire motel. When I reached the lobby, it was empty. The man at the front desk was gone, his chair pushed back as if he'd left in a hurry. The only sound was the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner. I called out, but no one answered. That's when I noticed the ledger on the counter. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed and worn, filled with names and dates. But as I skimmed the entries, I realized something strange. The most recent date was over a year ago. A loud bang from the hallway made me jump, the sound echoing through the empty space. I hurried back toward the room, my heart pounding. The hallway seemed darker now, the flickering lights casting ominous shadows. When I reached room 14, I froze. The door was ajar. "Lila." I called out, stepping inside. The room was empty. The TV was on again, but instead of static, it displayed a live feed of the hallway outside our room. The camera angle was low, as if someone was holding the camera at waist level. As I stared at the screen, the feed flickered, and the camera began to move, slowly panning down the hallway toward the lobby. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was seeing. It was live. Whoever was holding the camera was walking toward the lobby, toward me. I bolted from the room, my mind racing. "Lila!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty motel. I ran down the hallway, past darkened rooms, until I reached the side exit. The door was slightly open, snow blowing in from the storm. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow was nearly blinding. I called Lila's name again, my voice barely carrying over the storm. That's when I saw them, footprints, leading away from the motel and into the woods. Without thinking, I followed them. The woods were dark and foreboding, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The footprints led deeper and deeper, winding between the trees in a strange, meandering pattern. I called Lila's name over and over, my voice hoarse from the cold. Finally, I saw her. She was standing in a small clearing, her back to me. "Lila!" I shouted, running toward her. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. She was completely still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Lila!" I whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She turned, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't Lila. The thing standing in front of me looked like her, same clothes, same hair, but its face was wrong. The features were blurred, like a smudged painting, and its eyes were empty, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling into the snow. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I felt its gaze boring into me. Then it smiled. I don't remember how I got back to the motel. The next thing I knew, I was in the car, the engine running, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Lila was sitting in the passenger seat, pale and silent. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't ask questions. I drove through the storm, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We didn't talk about what had happened, and we never went back. To this day, I don't know who, or what, I saw in those woods. Lila refuses to discuss it, but sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring out the window, her expression distant and haunted. And I wonder if whatever we left behind is still waiting for us to return.